Hey guys, it's 242 here. Today I'm going to read you 5 stories that are scary or creepy. They are from the subreddits, creepy encounters, scary stories, let's not meet, and ghost stories. There are timestamps in the description box for all these stories so you can skip where you like. Before I start, I just want to remind you that I have a subreddit and now I have a Patreon. All the links are in the description box. So with that, turn off the lights, relax, and listen to the creepy stories.
The scariest night of my life. This is a long one, so stay with me. Allow me to set the stage for this. I was 19 at the time this took place. I was a Marine, and I was one of the first deployments to Afghanistan. Not too far from my platoon's patrol base, 3 to 6 kilometers or so, was this structure that looked like a castle. Through interpreted conversations with the locals, we were able to determine that they believed it was built by Alexander the Great. Whether that is true or not, I will never know. But let me tell you, this place looked ancient. So, being Marines, we did the only thing we thought was prudent at the time. We went out on patrol with the intent of setting an OP inside the structure. We took our Afghan border police with us. When they got close to the structure and our Afghans figured out what we were up to, they refused to go any further. Before they left, they kept repeating the same word over and over. Don't ask me to remember what it was because this was a decade ago and there's no way I can remember that. But what I do know now is that they were trying to warn us of evil spirits. We went in anyways, without our Afghans, with the intention of staying there overnight. This place was basically an ancient fort with mud/clay brick walls on all 4 sides, with a building in the middle. So, we set security, made sure that we had comm checks with our patrol base, and they had an update position report on us so they knew where we were in case we got into trouble. Darkness fell. Not too long after, I went up to take my turn on the wall with my friend, watching for anyone that might be trying to sneak up on us, and any other Taliban-related shenanigans. Not 20 minutes into our shift was when the weird stuff started going down. The entire time I was on the wall, I felt watched from all sides. I turned to see a figure walking along the wall, not far from where we were sitting. I saw it walking, but it was a robed figure that looked almost floating. I turned to my friend to see if he saw it too, and he said he did, but when he got his night vision back on, it was his turn to rest. The figure was gone. We didn't see anything else after that for the rest of the shift. We uneasily finished and went to rest where I ended up dozing off at some point. I don't know what happened next, but I woke to a completely black figure literally squatting on my chest. When I went to yell for help, nothing came out, and it felt like a hand was over my mouth. I reached for my knife. I was a machine gunner and couldn't grab my machine gun, and I felt like something was pinning my arms to the ground. I tried to squirm free and couldn't move. So I bit down as hard as I could on what felt like a hand on my mouth. At that point, whatever weight was on me instantly disappeared and I could move and talk again. At this point, I was freaking out and my brothers who were around me saw me. My training had kicked in and I was trying my best to keep quiet and not pass out because I was hyperventilating. My squad mates calmed me down and after telling them what happened, they all admitted to having the creeps and the feeling of being watched the whole time we've been here. None of us could sleep and we all basically sat back to back for the rest of the night when we weren't on watch. We were pretty freaked out, so every noise, and rustling of the wind made it even worse in the total silence of that ancient fort in that ancient desert. If you haven't experienced the silence of an open desert in the part of the world where there's absolutely zero light and noise pollution, then I suppose it can be hard to appreciate how any noise in a place like that, in the middle of the night, in total darkness, when you're already alert to sounds of the enemy, and now on even higher alert for something you can't understand, is just about the scariest thing anyone could ever experience. I will never experience that kind of fear again in my life. Ever. To finish this, as soon as the sun came up, we left. Everyone was scared, and none of us spoke about it again to each other. We never went back to that area again, and I still suffer from nightmares and sleep paralysis because of the personal experience that night. The scariest part of this whole thing is that I know it's probably just in my head. That's my, I guess, ghost story. If it stuck out, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Have you ever met a serial killer? This is a quote from Lisa Perry. Ted Bundy. I was 17 and living in Seattle in 1974, and my boyfriend and I went to Lake Sammamish on one of the first beautiful days of the season. I was sunbathing on a towel near the building that housed the restrooms. My boyfriend, not a fan of just laying in the sun, was 50 yards away or so, leaning on his parked car, chatting with some other guys. I noticed a man kept walking by me to use the drinking fountains. Each time he passed, he would stare a bit. I thought he was attractive enough, but in a real dweeb kind of way. Finally, he approached me, and we started a conversation. He asked me if I wanted to go out in his canoe. I said, no, probably not, that I was here with my boyfriend. He then said if I would help him launch it into the water, that it was tucked behind some trees across the parking lot. I said I was completely not strong enough to help him with a canoe, but that my boyfriend could surely lend a hand. I got up and started walking towards where my boyfriend was leaning against the car. Bundy followed me, and just about the same time that he said,
No, you can do it,
I called out to my boyfriend and said, hey, this guy wants some help with his canoe. My boyfriend immediately felt the chill. He told Bundy in the rudest way I have ever heard him speak to anyone, which he said he had done in a primal revulsion to this guy, to
get the hell away from her and from us.
Bundy said directly to me, and this is the iciest piece that stays with me most.
This is your lucky day.
Of course, I didn't understand that for a long time. That day, he murdered 2 women that he picked up at that lake. 2, both resembling me in stature and the way we wore our hair. Never answer your door at night. This isn't my story, but a girl from my old youth group story, which happened years ago. But it still freaks me out, so I feel like it needs to be shared. Basically, what happened was her grandparents woke up one night to someone pounding on their front door, so obviously they get up to go check who it is, because it was so late, around 2 or 3 a.m. Her grandpa looks through their peephole and sees this woman in bloodied and tattered clothes pounding on their door, yelling and screaming about how they need to let her in and she's hurt and she needs to come in. Obviously, her grandpa called the cops and informed them of what happened, but didn't let the woman in. She continued to pound on the door for a couple minutes before she finally stopped. Their grandpa figured that maybe she had left to go to another house, but no. He looked through the peephole and saw the lady staring at the peephole with no expression on her face. Eventually, a man walked up to the door, and him and the lady walked away as if nothing happened. I don't know what happened afterwards, if the police ever caught them, but I still think about this story to this day, and it gives me the chills every time. Always call the police if you find yourself in a situation like this, and never open your door. You don't know who that person is and what they're capable of. I was kidnapped at 4 years old and didn't realize. I'll start by saying I have a terrible biological father. He has been a shady person all my life and constantly causing me a lot of grief. This is just one of those examples. When I was 4, my parents split up. My mother and I moved states, and they agreed I would visit my dad every school holidays for a week. This one particular time, I had been with him for a few days. When I was playing with my cousin at a nearby park, a car pulled up and I recognized the man as one of my dad's friends. He called me over, and without thinking, I ran over to him and left my cousin at the park. He asked me if I could show him where my dad lived, and I agreed and got into his car. I gave directions and didn't notice at all that they weren't following them correctly. Looking back, I didn't really know the way anyhow. After way too long, I did realize that we were getting closer to the city, which is far from my dad's house. We pulled up to a house I didn't recognize, and the man told me to wait in the car. I did. I didn't feel scared at all for some reason. He eventually took me inside, and I definitely started to feel unsafe then. I mainly remember 2 girls passed out with their tops off, and a much older man was filling them up everywhere. I made eye contact with this man, and he made me sick to my stomach. I had definitely figured out that this was a bad situation by this point. A lady took me into a bedroom and brought me a sandwich. The bread was stale and I wasn't hungry, but I ate it all because I felt bad for her, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what I was thinking about. The lady told me a lot of things I didn't understand, but when she left, I remember thinking my dad was coming to pick me up soon. I fell asleep, waiting for him. I wet the bed that night, and no one came to see me the next day until I cried very loudly and banged on the door. The lady came back and yelled at me for stinking up the bedroom, and I asked about my dad. She said he was coming tonight after he finished work. She didn't offer me a shower or a bath, so I sat in my soiled pants all day. After that, everything turns into a blur, really. My dad did not come that night, and I was terrified. In my head, I felt like I had been there for months. I thought it was missing school and everyone had forgotten about me. In reality, I was there for 5 days. They let me take 1 shower. I do not remember eating much except for boring sandwiches, and I had chips and gravy once. Finally, my mom drove across the country to come and get me. After not being able to get a hold of me or my dad for so long, and then me missing my pre-booked flight home, she panicked and came looking for me. Thank goodness she did. She found my dad at his girlfriend's house, methed out completely, hiding out. Turns out he owed a lot of drug money to the people who had taken me. they had told him that they had me, but he couldn't afford it or didn't want me back. Whatever it was, he didn't bother trying to get me back. My amazing mom paid his debt for him after borrowing from a lot of people, and she came to get me back. I remember when someone came into the room and told me my mom was there, and I walked out and I could smell her. It was the best feeling to feel safe again. She took me home, and I didn't see my dad again for a long time. She never called the police. My parents' relationship was very complicated then, and I fully understand the choice she made. I'm definitely okay now. I've spoken about this in therapy, and I've come to terms with most of the things that I went through as a child. But it's still an effed up situation for a 4-year-old girl to have to be in. So to my dad's friend and the sandwich lady and even my dad himself, let's not meet. My first playmate was the blacksmith's son, who sang for me in the cemetery. Problem was, he died around 1900, as the local priest later confirmed to my parents. This is quite a long story, and I'm leaving a lot out as it is, but maybe someone here will find it interesting. So, while this happened to me, I was so young that I don't actually remember all of this, but have heard it secondhand so many times that I know the whole story. The last time this happened with this particular ghost is actually my earliest memory. So when I was little, the very first house I lived in as a baby was this old 18th century townhouse that my parents rented from the local doctor. Suffice to say, the place was super haunted. It's a story from another day, but 3 years ago they finally sealed the upper floor off entirely, and the doctor told my mom that nobody will ever step foot up there again. The bottom floor is now the GP office and waiting room. Now, all that aside, growing up in that environment left me with a major sensitivity to spirits that is still kinda active sometime. I'm 25 now. When I was a kid, I terrified my entire extended family with the things that I would come out with at random. Anyway, one of the most popular stories my parents tell at barbecues and parties, and just to anyone who will listen, happened when I was 2, and my mom wanted to pop in to visit my grandfather's grave. Her family is from a village about 20 minutes drive away, and there are 2 graveyards, the new one and the old one. My grandfather is buried in the old one in the old family plot. This graveyard has since been locked, and you have to get a key from a priest to get in. So, being 2, I wasn't overly interested in sitting down by a graveside to pray with my parents, and they were happy enough to let me wander so long as I stayed in their sight, and lucky for them, I didn't go far. I bolted down the path and stopped about halfway back among the tombstones, where I started to sort of sway on the spot and dance as much as a 2-year-old is capable of. My parents watched me for a few minutes but didn't think much of it, and then told me we were leaving. My dad picked me up and we headed to the gate. Just before we left, I turned over his shoulder, looked around, and smiled, and waved at something. They obviously didn't really think it was anything to be concerned about, because a week later, we went back. My grandfather had died the day before their wedding 4 years earlier, and my mom had been very close to him, so we visited fairly often. This time, when we went in, I didn't even wait for permission. I ran back to the same graveside where I had begun swaying on the spot again, looking up over the grave in the air as if something was suspended there. It's probably worth describing the grave, but there isn't much to describe. It was a very small patch of earth that didn't even have a border, fairly overgrown,
and with a totally rusted small iron cross at the head of it. There was no nameplate, no indication of who was buried there, and it clearly wasn't a recent grave. Keep in mind, literally nobody is buried in the cemetery anymore except for a couple more of my family members who went into the family plot. At this point, my parents are creeped out. My dad, who swears blind that he does not believe in ghosts and never will, came down to ask me what I was doing, and I explained that I was dancing. He asked me why, and I pointed above the iron cross and in the jumbled English of a toddler said,
"The boy is singing, and he wants me to dance."
My dad picked me up, ran past my mom, and got into the car to wait for my mom. They went to my great-grandmother's house across the street and told her the whole story, but they all agreed it sounded a bit ridiculous the more they thought about it. And since I was only 2, it was probably just a game, so they went back. They entered through a different gate, they went over the wall. No matter what they did to try and confuse the 2-year-old me, I always went back to the same grave. And once there was nothing special about it. It wasn't beautiful or impressive. There was no reason for a 2-year-old to be so drawn to that little patch of earth, but I always went straight there. I'd always dance while he sang to me, and I'd always wave to him before I left, regardless of which side we left from or which winding path they took out of the place. They brought other family members with them as witness. They had family friends question me about it, and I always told them the same story. My earliest memory is of my grandmother sitting me down on the cemetery wall while I was trying to dance as instructed, while my parents looked at me, totally scared, and asked me to describe him or tell her what his name was. I don't think I answered her, but I remember finding the looks on their faces just so unbelievably funny because they were so scared of my friend who only wanted to sing to me. What I didn't know was that my great-grandmother had told the priest, brought him in there to show him the grave, and asked if there was any way to know who was buried in the little unmarked plot. He went off and checked the burial records, and sure enough, 5-year-old Robert, the blacksmith's son, had died of TB almost a century earlier and laid there, marked only by the little iron cross that his father had made for him. Funny enough, my great-grandmother knew the blacksmith. He was their next-door neighbor, but he was an old man when she was a little girl, so she never knew the little boy. My parents stopped bringing me to see my friend after that. We only went into the cemetery for funerals. We also moved out of the doctor's house, but it was a few years before I stopped being a creepy little kid that terrified anyone that spoke to me. I actually did go back a couple of years ago and brought a friend of mine visiting Europe from Boston. She told me when we met that she could speak to ghosts, and after a couple weeks I started divulging the hundreds of stories I had from childhood, and she asked if she could come to the cemetery with me. Since the gate was locked, we had to hop the wall, but once we were inside, she pointed clear across the top of the headstones and said,
"Hey, isn't it over there?"
pointing at its location. I nodded and she started walking towards it and stopped right at the iron crosses.
"This one?"
I nodded. I swear, this is totally real. She stood there for a second and then started backing away. I didn't have to ask her why. It was the middle of December, and yet the air seemed to fizz and get really, really hot. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and the pressure that built up in my head made it feel like my scalp would split open. She told me she wanted to leave, but I was already running out of there at this point, and we vaulted the wall like Olympians. I don't know what happened that day, since I'm not a child anymore and didn't really see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling afterwards that my little friend there felt like I had brought her with me so I could impress her, and he didn't like it. Not at all.
And that's the end of our stories. I hope you liked it. If you did, please hit that like button. If you'd like to hear more, hit that subscribe button and that shiny, shiny bell. I hope you have a good night or a good day. Goodbye.